you're downplaying it a little bit. Everybody listening and watching today, Kit and James have gone to some extraordinary lengths to get some of the finest minds in the world to look at all of this that Kit's just mentioned, from energy to food, transportation, the race to net zero, how economies and countries and corporations achieve that, what needs to happen to get to that point, what are the risks that are involved in doing that, but also the huge opportunities that presents, and what we continue to see with the crisis that's unfolding at the moment is that. Welcome to the Exponential Investor Podcast. Want to be a better, smarter, more clued up investor? Well, you've come to the right place. We cover the breakthrough investment ideas you don't hear about in the mainstream to keep you on top of the megatrends and opportunities reshaping our world. Good morning. Welcome to the Exponential Investor Podcast. This is quite an important episode of the podcast this week, with so much happening in the world. There's so much to discuss. There's so many avenues we could go down and look at the moment. But first of all, Kit, welcome again for joining us. Great to have you on board, because I will again be calling on your expertise in the energy markets this week, because with Russia invading the Ukraine, turmoil and havoc has hit the energy markets. It's only going to get more volatile, and who knows exactly where it's going to end up. But I wanted to start with a couple of things. So what we've seen off the back of this invasion, this kickoff of conflict, there's a spike in the oil price. Now there's talk that basically globally Russia won't be able to sell their oil to anyone, anywhere. So there will be zero demand for Russian oil as the rest of the world kind of mobilizes to choke them out financially, and the oil market obviously being one of their primary sources of revenue, of GDP for the country, is a crucial way to choke them out, so to speak. So we've seen the price of oil punch comfortably through $100. The Bank of America is calling that it's going to possibly hit $200. And if you wind all the way back to March 2020, when the pandemic struck and oil markets were bottoming out, one of the greatest trades probably of the last few decades would have been to go long oil from the bottom of 2020 to today, because you would have made an absolute mint. Now, my question though is, how does this kind of play out? Because now we're looking at, there seems to be a kind of undercurrent of this move that European countries are now talking more about energy independence. Obviously, energy independence was a big thing under the Trump regime. It's kind of seems to have been passed aside during Biden's time in power. Germany's now talking about this idea of energy independence, even though they've got rid of a lot of their nuclear generation capacity. They obviously sort of bet their money on being able to get energy from Russia, but now that's been shut out. Big companies like BP are divesting all of their Russian energy assets. Russian energy companies are tanking. Where does this end up? Is this a market now full of opportunities, or are we going to see more short-term pain in the energy markets, where they will again create more opportunities for the long run? How does this kind of play out with what you're looking at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously the biggest thing that's happened in the energy markets since COVID. I think you're right to say that there is and will be a continued amount of short-term pain, and also an amount of long-term opportunity as well. And I think the COVID analogy is quite apt, actually, because when COVID first hit, everyone sort of said, renewables, the transition, it's this luxury thing that we kind of need to do if we have the money and the time. But when there's a real problem, the world will look the other way and focus on what's in front of it. And, James Allen, my colleague, and I, we were both saying that actually this is, the opposite. We had this postcard from the future of lower energy use, lower pollution in our cities. And it was this sort of incredible sudden revolutionization or galvanization, I should say, of energy when it came to transitioning away from fossil fuels. The COP26 had some of the biggest agreements we've seen in a long time. And suddenly the energy going into the transition was just enormous. The stocks involved in the sector rallied incredibly in 2020. And the turnaround, the sudden change of direction from what people thought the pandemic would do to what actually happened was very swift. And the investment returns were also very powerful. And I think, initially with all of the Ukraine buildup and stuff, everyone was sort of saying, oil, gas, coal, forget your renewables. This is a gas crisis. We need more gas, blah, blah, blah. But suddenly what we're seeing is two things. Is firstly, everyone thinks renewables. They think solar and wind are intermittent because they're not sort of a baseload source of electricity like gas. But we're suddenly realizing that gas and oil, they're not quite as reliable as people would have hoped them to be because they're under the control of these extraordinary countries which have a disproportionate amount of control over our heating bills, I suppose you could say. And already just in the 5 days since, or in the week since last Thursday and Friday, the response we're seeing is very swift. So, figures like Bill McGibbon, who's a big environmentalist and author over in America, he's been saying, dig for victory, buy heat pumps. America needs to mobilize its industry to build the decarbonization technologies that will get Europe off Russian gas. The biggest sanction we can impose upon them is to stop buying their fossil fuels, because fossil fuels make up 60% of Russian export revenues every year. So they actually need our cash a lot more than we need their gas, and there are avenues for us to decarbonize. And obviously the long-term solution for us is renewables. It's solar, wind, hydropower, and a few other options as well in the mix. You mentioned nuclear, and the sacred cows that are being culled one after another at the moment are things like Germany's nuclear shutdown. I've seen politicians already discussing whether that's a wise idea in Germany, which we've seen none of in the last year. Also, liquid natural gas and gas as a sort of transition fuel. Suddenly, with energy security on everyone's minds, Europe will be going to America and begging for liquid natural gas. They'll be ramping up their terminal capacity, and that is a short-term fix. So although the long-term solution is renewables, things like energy efficiency, liquid natural gas, and maybe any other ways we can sort of reduce our reliance on Russia for now. This is going to be another swing upwards, I think, in the transition away from coal, away from, energy unsecurity, and towards hopefully renewables in the long term with a few short-term fixes in between.
One of the things I saw was that there's going to be an increase in uptake of LNG imports from LNG-rich areas. Obviously, Australia being one of those, so that sort of hits my radar when those terms LNG and Australia get thrown together. But obviously, there's an environment. You're not going to get to net zero when you're shipping LNG from Australia to the ports in Europe. That's for sure. But I think it is a short-term fix, and certainly for me, I've been running through the ideas of what are the short-term sort of opportunities in this space with all of this kicking off in the energy markets, and it feels like obviously it seems to indicate that with this demand drop off for Russian oil, that you're going to see continued increases in price for crude, for WTI. So I think we'll continue to see increases in those markets. I think the LNG style, if you look at some of the LNG funds that are out there, 6, 7, 8% up daily at the moment. So there's, I think, opportunity in the direct access to some of these resources and commodities. But then obviously the players, the refiners, the miners that access some of these, I think there are some of those short-term opportunities. Like you say, there is obviously a long-term fix to get to that point of energy independence. And I keep bringing up nuclear because I cannot see how countries can achieve energy independence that are not energy and resource rich themselves, that have to bring it in from somewhere else. I can't see how they can achieve that without revisiting the nuclear option. And I think that this is, for a long time, and we've discussed this before, nuclear energy has been very much on the nose. It's a very bad PR campaign. But I've been wondering over many years now, what is the turning point that makes society realize there's actually probably greater benefits from nuclear energy than the perceived detractions of it? And this might be it. This, for me, might be the turning point where people actually realize that nuclear is not a dirty word, but a legitimate way to move forward towards energy independence. And I think we're going to see the two of the big themes out the back of this. And I had a discussion earlier about this with somebody else, and the idea that if Putin stays in power, the world will not transact with Russia again while he remains in power. That seems to be almost a given. So that's going to crush Russia's economy and any company that is affiliated or linked to Russia and Putin's regime in any way, which then all of a sudden means that the demand for energy and the demand for all of these resources and materials around the rest of the world doesn't stop. But anything they used to get from Russia, they now have to get from somewhere else. And that's where I think people should be looking short term. But like you say, the long-term renewable solution is key. And I think we might be seeing a nuclear resurgence. I hope we are going to see a nuclear resurgence, because I think that's a big opportunity. So we're talking about uranium miners, some of the big nuclear companies that are putting these things together. Does nuclear fall into what you guys are looking at for the opportunities as part of all of this? I know you and James have been working on a pretty important project recently, which is about to go live, which maybe you could tell our readers a little bit more in detail about today. We kind of alluded to it the other week. Do all of these things fall into what you guys are looking at, or are you keeping it the lane pretty narrow, or how broad and how much opportunity do you see from what's happening at the moment?
Yeah, well, I mean, currently we are experiencing a Russo-Ukrainian crisis. 2 years ago, we had a pandemic crisis, but overshadowing all of these things is a climate crisis. And I think it's fair to say that, as we mentioned, 60% of Russian export revenues come from fossil fuels. If you're the leader of that country and you see your biggest customers promising that they're absolutely going to transition as quickly and effectively away from those fuels as they possibly can, you start to sort of see the end. Putin has not tried to diversify the Russian economy. He's doubled down on fossil fuel and commodity exports. And, they're looking down a pretty bleak path economically if the transition goes ahead. So that will be playing into the Ukrainian crisis. And as we mentioned as well, the climate crisis and the pandemic seem to intertwine in people's minds, where the pandemic just triggered them to take the climate crisis so much more seriously. And the pledges, the social, political and financial support we've seen since the pandemic are, incredible. There's been a step change in the pace of those things. And to be honest, it's yet to be explained exactly what that psychological link is, why one crisis triggered a response to another. But it's certainly been very good in that very narrow sense. On the nuclear question, it's a classic side of two debates. I mean, where I always end up is nuclear is pretty expensive to build a new plant. The smaller, cheaper technologies known as small modular reactors are maybe 5, 10, probably 15 years away from being commercially viable, and maybe a few extra years away from making a real difference to carbon emissions. But at the same time, nuclear is, once it's already been built, a source of electricity that causes no harm to human health in the form of sort of pollutants and emissions in the air, and it causes no harm to the planet either, apart from the issue obviously of uranium waste and how that's stored, but that is manageable. And so compared to things like coal and gas for firing electricity, it's so vastly superior that we need to maintain the plants that we currently have. And I think that's the priority, and everyone's talking about Germany with good reason. This crisis more than any shows that it would be very foolish to shut down their nuclear plants for immediate reasons and for long-term climate reasons as well. And yeah, I can go in and talk a little bit more about what James and I have been working on. You talked about the breadth. I think another topic in the Russo-Ukrainian crisis is food. So two commodities that have been soaring in recent days so far this week. Just very specifically this week is wheat and corn. Broadly, food commodities over the last year have been a driver and a victim of the inflation that we've seen in the UK, in Europe, in America, all over the world. As we know, food prices rising are a very, very bad thing for everyone. Food and energy, the two last things you'd want to go up, have been rising steeply. But wheat and corn specifically, I think corn and wheat are key exports of Ukraine. So Ukraine is responsible for 16% of global corn exports and 12% of global wheat supplies. So they're key commodities from this region. And it's going to be a huge sort of factor from the Russo-Ukrainian crisis as well. But you talk about decarbonisation, and food is one of those massively underestimated things there as well. I think it's responsible for anywhere between, depending on who you ask, 15 and 30%. The data platform Our World in Data, they have it at 26% of global emissions come from the food industry, and that's, deforestation to grow the soy to feed the cows. It's the land use change. It's transportation, packaging. It's the carbon emissions from all the vehicles involved, and it's also a massive issue with food waste as well, where all those emissions that go into producing food, something like 15,000 tons of carbon are needed for every kilo of beef and 17,000 litres of water as well. So it's a water crisis as much as anything else. We waste a third of our food after all those emissions and after all that water that we use to grow it or rear it. And we're speaking about energy today, but the race to net zero, the goal to decarbonize the global economy so that we get to a sort of sustainable footing in how we operate on this planet, that is not going to happen with gas instead of coal. It's not going to happen by turning Germany's nuclear plants back on, and it's not going to happen by getting our entire national grids to 100% renewables, solar, wind, nuclear, and hydro, because that's not enough. That's 20 to 40% of global emissions come from the energy system. Everything else is still rolling on, and food, resources, how we extract the metals and the minerals that we need to fuel our consumer habits, which are a great thing. Capitalism has delivered more wealth than anything else in history. It's pulled more people out of poverty than anything in history. So we want to find ways to continue our current operating system, but on a more sustainable footing. And looking at food, looking at resources, looking at transport, sort of broadening that out is something James and I have been looking a lot at, I should say. And we've collected a few people. You might know one of them very well, Sam. Just to interview them on this sort of broader sustainability revolution, the way in which the energy transition is expanding, the way in which low-cost renewables are enabling companies in every sector to decarbonize their operations and become more sustainable. And whether it's experts in sustainable, responsible, and ethical investing, or whether it's technology whizzes like yourself and Owen Tracy, or whether it's authors on the incredible transitions that are happening in food, in solar, or in resources. We've collected 6 brilliant guests, and we're hoping to host some of our listeners and readers from today to a sort of investor conference that starts on Monday, the 14th of March. We'll sort of release the videos through the course of the week. It's a completely free conference, but it's just sort of examining all of these fascinating themes that you and I talk about every week, but with real experts from the field, going in depth with them on the sort of the challenges, the risks, and of course the opportunities for investors that go with them. So I conducted those interviews. I think we got some really great guests in. I'm really excited to share them with everyone. And I think I'm hoping that we can get a link below this video somewhere so that if people like what they hear and can sign up, they should be able to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're downplaying it a little bit. Everybody listening and watching today, Kit and James have gone to some extraordinary lengths to get some of the finest minds in the world to look at all of this that Kit's just mentioned, from energy to food, transportation, the race to net zero, how economies and countries and corporations achieve that, what needs to happen to get to that point, what are the risks that are involved in doing that, but also the huge opportunities that presents, and what we continue to see with the crisis that's unfolding at the moment is that markets are volatile when these sorts of events happen, but there are ways for investors to continue to build wealth off the back of them. We talked at the top about the oil price and some of the great trades that you could have made out of that, and LNG, and obviously it expands further than that. We talked about nuclear, but then like you mentioned as well, hydro, solar, all of those kinds of technologies that are not slowing down and are not regressing, but are continuing to progress and improve the technologies and innovation in that space. And as Kit's mentioned, there's a week-long investor broadcast that's going out that there will be a link, as I say, below this video in the email that's been sent to you that will give you access to that broadcast. I know some of the people that Kit has spoken to, as he mentioned, one of them being me. And I think it's a must watch. If you want to understand what's happening in this space, what's really going on, where the opportunities lie, cut through all the garbage that you see in mainstream media, which is just clickbaity. And you really want to understand how, as an investor, you can sort of protect yourself from some of these risks, but also manage them and find the opportunities. Then by all means, make sure you've signed up to that investor broadcast. It's going to be, as Kit mentioned, free to access. So you just need to pop your name down. It'll be a free week-long broadcast with, as I say, some of the finest minds in the world talking about all these opportunities. I think you would be bonkers to miss it. If anything, it is going to empower you and provide you with a greater level of understanding about what is really happening in these markets. I think it's a must watch. So make sure you get your name down on that for that investor broadcast. As I said, there'll be links all around for you to see and click on to make sure that you get access to that. But thanks again for joining us this week, Kit. Can't wait for that investor broadcast to go live. I hope everyone gets their name down for it. A lot of great information to come over the next week in relation to that, and then obviously the broadcast itself. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back with you again next week with another Exponential Investor podcast. No doubt this Russian-Ukrainian conflict will continue, and there will be plenty more to unveil and talk about as the situation unfolds over the coming weeks. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now.